as you're talking, though, I can see why the beginning is such a problem and why that's so.
Yeah.
Again, not trying to create like some kind of gotcha moment or like, oh, I want to have beef with Robert Pippin, right? I've had him on the show, enjoyed talking to him, so that's not my goal.
He's great. I've met him. I've been to many of his talks. He's brilliant. And
yeah.
If it weren't for Pippin, I wouldn't have written a book on Hegel. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. But I'm reading through, I think it's Hans Dieter, and he's talking about. I'm reading about Fichte. I'm probably saying it wrong.
Yeah.
That for him the beginning is the I, not I. Is that kind of what is being traced as the beginning when Pippin's talking about Hegel?
It's perhaps closer to that. For Pippin, what is going on in the logic is that we're attempting to apply categories. And we do that in judgment. So there's an I that is thinking, applying categories. And for Pippin, the sort of basic move, so to speak, of this I is to apply something in judgment. And then it finds out that applying the category of pure being is essentially to apply the category of pure nothingness, because it has no content. We try to think pure being and it's just empty. So then we've got nothingness. And then, that gives us becoming in some way. And but it's a little different to what's going on in Fichte. We can perhaps talk about that. It might, but maybe, we can. But maybe I should explain the idea first.
No. It's absolutely. I apologize, Gallo. I as we're talking about historical particularity, I realized why the beginning was an issue. So I realized we've kind of gone down a rabbit trail.
I can talk about the beginning.
You seem more interested in talking about the idea. Let's talk about the idea. I mean, okay. I want to be respectful of your time. So,
I'm also very interested in the beginning, because I give an account of the beginning in this book that is novel, and I think it makes sense at the beginning.
Let's do that. I'm
sure we'll disagree. We can do that, and then we can go into the idea and the Wittgensteinian samples and all that. So the beginning has there's a problem that Hegel notes, and that is that while other sciences, so this is the science of logic, Wissenschaft der Logik, while other sciences can begin with certain presuppositions, certain axioms from you can derive lemmas, but immediately, so to speak, and then we can begin with definitions or something, and then from those you just accept all those things as presuppositions, and then you get underway with the science. Because the science of logic is supposed to be the science of thought, you can't begin with anything like that. All determinations of thought and axioms, lemmas, definitions, they would all be determinations of thought. Because they determine how the thought of that science functions, gets along. The science of logic, as the science of thought itself, cannot begin with any determinations. All determinations must arise within it. But this is a problem, because the question is then, well, how do we begin? We can't begin with any presuppositions. So what exactly, right? And Hegel puts this in the language of mediation and immediacy. It must be immediate. The beginning must be immediate in that, it can't presuppose anything. It can't be sort of predetermined in any way. But of course, it's got to be mediated in some fashion. It's got to come, the science has to begin from somewhere. And Hegel suggests that the science of logic just begins with immediacy itself. there's a big question mark over that. People have tried to figure out what this immediacy is. I think that there's this Hegel scholar called William Maker. Not all that well known, but I think should be more widely read. He wrote a lot on the beginning of the logic, and he argues that the immediacy that the logic begins with is essentially a cancellation of all structures of reflection, and by that he means all structures within which thought would be predetermined or determined from the outside or something, from something that's not it. So he thinks also that Hegel Hegel does say that the science of logic does have one presupposition, and that is the phenomenology of spirit. Maker makes sense of this by stating that the logic presupposes the phenomenology of spirit as the work in which all structures of reflection, all structures within which thought might end up as predetermined, get cancelled. So in that sense, it's a presupposition, but it doesn't give us any content or anything. All we get from this is thought is not predetermined, and that's the immediacy that the logic supposedly begins with, according to Maker. And I think that is the most promising way of trying to understand what Hegel means by immediacy. It's the sort of negation of all structures of reflection. So basically, thought is not predetermined. That's the immediacy. And then Hegel says that that immediacy has one determination, and that's that it is the beginning of the science of logic, if such a science is possible. So I think that what you have at the beginning of the logic is essentially thought as not predetermined. That's extremely vague. It doesn't really give you anything, but it has this determination that if a science of logic it is that thing, a science of logic being possible, it would be the beginning of that science, because that science must begin with thought being not predetermined, right? It's the only thing it can begin with. If it's predetermined, then the science of logic as the science of thought itself wouldn't be possible, because it wouldn't account for the initial determination of thought. So it must be the beginning of the science of logic, if such a science is possible. What happens though, and that's the determination of pure being, or is it? Yeah, you like to jump in?
Forgive me. Yes. Yeah. So when we talk about the negation of structures of representation,
if I'm saying structures of reflection,
excuse me. And I'm perfectly happy for both these examples to be wrong. I think what I'm doing is I'm just getting these out of my head so we can make like, we're not talking about like a baby, right? That hasn't have any, and are we talking in any Buddhist sense, like the emptying of the mind?
There's something, there's something there.
But it's not exactly like that.
It's not exactly like that. But what's interesting in Buddhism is that there's a kind of process of unselfing, to use Iris Murdoch's term. But the notion of like a self that is in some sense predetermined, the Cartesian self, the thinking thing that is distinct from extended things and all that, in that sense, it's predetermined. It's not the extended stuff, right? That all disappears in Buddhism, right? But the process for getting there with Hegel is a little different. You kind of Hegel in the Phenomenology, according to Maker's telling, and I think this is correct, is essentially it goes through all of the possible accounts you could give according to which thought would be predetermined. It tries to make sense of the idea of thought being predetermined in some at least minimal sense, in which there's an object out there, thought needs to match that object in some way, so it must be predetermined in such ways that it can match the thing. And Maker basically says, but at the point at which it's supposed to prove that this is the case, that thought is predetermined such that it can match the thing, the notion of thought as distinct from the object, or subjectivity as distinct from objectivity, falls apart. So the notion of predetermination falls apart. So that's where we get the negation of structures of reflection. And of course, that's not what happens in Buddhism on the path to nirvana and enlightenment stuff. So you don't sort of work through in a philosophical fashion all of these accounts of the opposition of subjectivity and objectivity.
So not the same at all, because one is they're both emptying, but one ends with a thinking subject and one is trying to get rid of the thinking subject.
I mean, the thinking subject also disappears for Hegel.
Thinking, yeah. but thinking still remains.
Well, just thought, just not predetermined thought is all that remains. Not a subject.
Yes, understood.
We don't get subjective thought until much later in the logic.
Yes, the subject disappears in both. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, one other. No, it was good. It was a good question. And one other disconnect, I think, is that for Hegel, this point at the end of the phenomenology is the beginning of something else that you get a lot of content from, namely the logic. We end up sort of building back up to an account of thought and in all of its determinations. And that's not the case in Buddhism either. So we don't then try to, develop something from the,
So in one, you're trying to obviously kind of end being, and the other one, you're trying to return to being. Is that like, I mean, I don't,
I don't want to give a reductive account of Buddhism, and
I'm not trying to get anyone in hot water. Yeah, no, I'm just, that was helpful.
But
Thank
certainly
you.
For Hegel, he's trying to, he's not even trying. He just thinks that this is how it occurs. If you get to this point of thought being, if we get an expression of thought as undetermined, or this completely abstract notion of thought as undetermined, what then happens is that it unfolds, these logical determinations unfold from one another, such that we get the logical structure of everything, and by the end of the logic, it then exits and expresses itself in everything. So we get the world and we get human subjects and all this stuff at the end. And I think that's different. Yeah, I'm not an expert in Buddhism. And
right. I'm not asking you to be a Buddhist expert too. But that's helpful for me to see. That's helpful because I think the negation of the structure of reflection is one of those phrases that it's helpful to unpack.
Yeah, definitely helpful to unpack. Yeah.
Okay. So now that we've basically cleared the slate, that we've negated the structure of reflection, the structures of reflection, where do we proceed from there?
Yeah. So because the logic is supposed to be the science of all thought determinations, if that logic is going to be possible, if that science is going to be possible, then it should begin with precisely this thing which isn't a thing, this thought as not predetermined. And so the logic, if it's possible, should just start. And because of that, this determination, this thought as not predetermined, or what Hegel otherwise calls pure being, it does have, if a logic is possible, if a logic starts, then it has the determination that it is the beginning of the science.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So if the science of logic turns out to be possible, then that determination, pure being, thought as not predetermined, turns out to have the determination that it is the science of logic's beginning. If nothing comes from it, then it's not that science's beginning, so it doesn't have that determination. It's just the end of the phenomenology, perhaps. So what we have at the beginning is pure being is this thought as not predetermined, has this determination that a science of logic being possible, it is this science's beginning. And then what happens is that determination just doesn't do anything, doesn't go anywhere. And so science of logic, and this is my reading of the beginning. It turns out straight away that a science of logic is not possible because that determination just didn't lead anywhere. So it loses the determination, namely the determination, a science of logic being possible, it is this science's beginning.
That gets sublated.
So what happens now is that it turns out that something happened. Namely, there was a loss of that determination. So this is, I call this in the book, Hegel's master trick. The science of logic, in failing to begin, in being impossible, is then possible. It does begin precisely because it can't. So this determination of thought as not determined is lost because it can't go anywhere. But then that loss is something happening, and that's what gives us pure nothingness. It's the thought as not predetermined, but without the determination because it doesn't go anywhere. But then what we find is that there has been a movement. Pure being has turned into pure nothingness by the loss of the determination, and that's when things kick off. Then suddenly the whole of the science of logic begins to unfold. But what's unique to this account is that we're not doing anything. We're not applying the category of pure being in judgment. We're not pushing it along. We're not, using the meanings of our terms, our language, to say something about what is implied by a term, or, in pure being, we're implying pure nothingness because it's empty, and nothing like that. We've just seen, we've just watched, we've looked on as pure being has lost the determination, and we just saw a movement unfold, and then we continue to just sort of watch on, to look on as the rest of it unfolds. And that's how the science of logic, according to my account, begins. And that means that it can develop itself to exhaustion, to completion, solely from its own resources and without motivation from anything else. It's just doing it itself. Of course, expressing itself in our words, in our thought, but nonetheless, our thought is just, in a sense, us watching on as it does this.
I think I'm following you, and I think that makes sense. Obviously, I'm not a Hegel scholar, and I'm not, where angels fear to tread, right? This is obviously a controversial issue, so I'll let it stand.
Very controversial.
Yes. So that's the beginning.
That's the beginning.
And then this works itself out in several determinations, which eventually ends in the idea.
Yeah. And so with the idea, I think the best way of talking about it is with reference to Wittgensteinian samples and what Hegel calls the concept, der Begriff. And the idea is just a redetermination of the concept. You might have heard mention of the concept when Hegelians are having a conversation with one another. The concept with a capital C, it's sort of the big concept. Often in the history of philosophy, concepts have been taken to be sort of abstract things, either abstract thought entities or Platonic forms or something like that, right? But they are these abstract general representations, for want of a better term, but in thought, in judgment, what we do is we take a concept like the concept of mug, right, which can apply to many, many things, and we apply it to some singular thing, or some particular thing. Often in history of philosophy, particularly in analytic philosophy, the notions of singularity and particularity aren't distinguished. Hegel does, and I'll say why in a moment. But often we think of concepts as just these abstract things that we then apply to more concrete things. Hegel doesn't think of concepts that way. He thinks that abstract concepts are, in a sense, just an abstraction from something else, from something that is more concrete. And so the best way of explaining what the concept is for Hegel and what a universal concept or a general concept is for Hegel is by talking about by talking about I think a Wittgensteinian sample. And so I'll do that now. But so if we take the meter rod for Wittgenstein, we can say that that rod determines the universal concept 1 meter long, because we're only able to say that something is 1 meter long, or represent something as 1 meter long by comparing it with this rod, at least implicitly, right? So we for something to be a meter long is just, and of course our standard for a meter has now changed, but talk back in Wittgenstein's time. For something to be 1 meter long and then to be represented with the concept 1 meter, the universal concept, is just for it to be like the rod with respect to length. But this rod, so it determines a universal concept, and the universal concept is not really, you can't disentangle the concept from the rod. It doesn't have a meaning independently of the rod. And for Wittgenstein, if someone asks for the meaning of the concept of 1 meter, you'd point to the rod, and you'd say, this thing, the length of this thing, so it's a concretely existing thing. It's a singular thing in that it's distinct from all other rods and all other things in the universe, but and we can talk about the way in which it's distinct by pointing out its role for us. So for us, it's the singular thing that we use when we want to say something is 1 meter long. It's a means of representation, as Wittgenstein would say. And it's unique in playing that role. Other rods don't.
Is this where we talk about, so everything is particular, but not everything is singular? So, because the rod is both singular and particular.
Yes.
The meter rod, but just any stick is particular, but it's not necessarily singular because it's not this concept.
Every stick will be singular because there'll be some distinguishing features, right? It'll be unique. It won't be like, two rods might be alike in being rods, but they won't be exactly the same rod. They'll have some distinguishing features. One might
I jumped ahead. Continue the explanation.
Yeah. So for the meter rod, it's singular in that, and we can highlight its singularity by pointing out the unique role it plays for us. Namely, it's the thing with which we must compare other things to say whether they are a meter long or not. And it can only play this role because it has a particular feature. And by particular, I mean it's not like, he's a particular person in that sort of saying there's something off, something odd. Particular in the sense that it has a feature that can be a feature shared by other things. And in this case, it's a length. So things being particular for Hegel is explainable in terms of they're sharing some common feature. That's the way we say a particular 1 meter rod, and then another particular 1 meter rod. they're different rods. They're both different singular things, but they share the same feature, which is their length. And in that sense, they're particular. They're particular 1 meter rods. So the sample, the exemplar, which is the meter rod in Paris for Wittgenstein, that is sort of unique again amongst all rods in that it's being singular. It's being treated as the very rod that we use to represent other things as 1 meter long and only representing by way of that rod. Its singularity is related to its particularity because it's only treated as that thing because it has a feature of length that other things can share. So its feature, its particular feature is what allows us to treat it as the singular thing that is unique. But it also is the only rod, the only thing that determines the universal concept of 1 meter. So this sample has universality because you can't disentangle the universal concept 1 meter from it. So it has universality. It has particularity. It has a feature that can be shared by other things, and it has singularity. It's distinct from all other things. And in that sense, it's sort of extra unique in that it's the one rod that determines our universal concept 1 meter. But it contains these determinations, universality, particularity, and singularity, and it contains them, or it expresses them, I should say. It expresses universality and singularity, but it also it expresses them in mutually determining relations. So the singularity determines the universal because it's the one thing that we treat as that thing with which we must compare other things to determine whether they are a meter long or not. So it determines the universal. The universal also determines the singularity. It's because this thing is the meaning of the concept 1 meter long that it is the thing that is singular, the one thing we treat in this way. And of course, both of those two determinations determine each other through the determination of particularity, through the particular feature of the length that the rod has. So that's one instance of the structure of the concept for Hegel. And Hegel would call this a concrete concept. And by that, it just means it's a concept that contains different determinations unified in one, basically. It's concrete in that sense, not abstract. But we can abstract from that and just talk about the concept 1 meter long now. But that's an abstraction from this thing.
From this concrete concept.
Exactly. And so for Hegel, all abstract concepts are just abstracted from concrete concepts. And I argue that the world for Hegel is structured. The world and thought is both structured by essentially Wittgensteinian samples, or just concrete concepts, to use Hegel's terms. And what those samples are, those exemplars are, is determined by our practices, human culture. What we decide should play the role of this thing, right? And for Hegel, the concept, the big concept, is just the determinations, all the determinations of singularity, because of course each singular thing expresses the determination of a singular, but all singularity is part of the concept. So all determinations of things that are distinct from one another, all particularity, all determinations that can be, in a sense, that are the determinations that are expressed by all features that can be shared by objects or objects. That's particularity, and then universality is essentially universality is the process, the universal process that determines itself through particularity and singularity. So it's the determination you find expressed in 1 meter long, or sepia, to use another example of Wittgenstein's.
would you so it all concepts start out as concrete concepts?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
does that make like the dialectic, would that be it would be material, be like a material dialectic, or
I mean, it's also ideal.
sorry, no,
But
I can't resist the it's a stupid joke. The
it's
so
not
I actually have a real
it's not quite
question.
Marx. It's not quite Marx.
Not quite there. Uh, you yeah. Once you work through Hegel and you're like, oh, I can see how you made that jump though. No,
Yeah.
the if you don't mind, I'd like to work through an example of my own just to see if I've got
Mhm.
this. I think the meter rod is a good example. In Lord of the Flies, the boys are arguing and they're talking over each other, and they find this beautiful shell, and they say whoever holds the shell gets to speak, and the shell becomes a symbol of order for them, but it's also literally the thing that is order because whoever holds it. And so you can tell when the order is broken because someone steps up and literally breaks the conch shell. Would the conch shell be both the universal, singular, and particular? Would it be an example of the concrete,
Yeah, I
the
think it would
concrete
be. I mean,
concept?
it'd be the concrete concept of order, to use your words. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, because that one to me, meter has some connotations where people are like, well, that's a science thing. But like when you talk
Yeah.
about order, that's super abstract. But
Yep.
it's buried in, like, it's literally, it is that is the order for them.
Yep. And of course, in that example, uh, order must be exhibited in the practices of who gets to speak, and so it's also it's a good example here because you don't just get one concrete concept. You get a network of concrete concepts that structure our
Yeah.
world and our thinking. And in that case, you've got this sort of key concrete concept. But of course, it then relates to other things like speech and behavior, and it structures a network of practices, and then um, and our thinking about those practices under different concepts, like what it is to talk and what it is to speak and what it is to have your turn and all that kind of stuff. So um, yeah.
And it's not exactly the same thing, but I think there's some correlation between, like, you have habits, or you have a habit, you have habits, and you have habitus. And when
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about this network, you have concrete concepts, and then kind of like conceptus, like this whole network of things that all work together. That when you add enough of that together, you end up with an entire culture.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's the idea for Hegel. I think that um, the way the world is, and the way our thought is, our conceptual thought is, are structured. They're both structured by concrete concepts that exist within networks and are decided upon in practice, and also their use is decided in practice. I mean, the meter rod again. Do we count something as a meter long only when it's exactly, I mean, down to the atom, the same length? Well, no,
Right.
not always. But I have a paper on this. Um, but as I point out in the paper, like when you're just constructing the Large Hadron Collider, measurements need to be far more precise than if I'm just going around measuring branches on a tree or something, right? I could say a branch on a tree is a meter long, but I need to be a bit more precise when I'm talking about like sections of the Large Hadron Collider. And so again, what the sample is, how it is used, and then and thus what a meter is determined by and in the practices. And so yeah, and the point of the logic, and so basically what the idea is, to get back to that initial question, the
Yeah.
idea is the structure of the concept that is all held together, all comprehended in its moment of universality, and it can only be comprehended as such in the element of human conceptual thought, and that is us basically thinking all these different determinations together as a unified whole, right? And so once the logic brings itself to completion and shows that it's unlimited, it's not limits or it's infinite, it's not limited by anything external to itself, and then must express itself in everything, I think that is precisely why Hegel said, or I think that is why Hegel sees the world and thought as both structured by samples, because the logical idea and moments of the logical idea just do express themselves in everything. And the determinations, the thought determinations and the determinations in the world are all just sort of workings out of the uses and the repercussions of concrete concepts.
One, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been an absolute joy.
Thank you for having me. It's been brilliant.
I've read a lot of Kierkegaard, and I feel like his critique of Hegel is that Hegel doesn't do anything. So I don't want this to come across as a critique. So, but as for my final question, for someone who's listened to this whole podcast, what would you recommend that they think about or do for the next week? What should be their response to this?
What should they do for the next week? I mean, I think one thing that that comes out of this is that there is, for Hegel, no single way the world is. And also there's no way of predicting what will happen next. As I said earlier on, the point of the logic is that it expresses itself in everything, but it's so poor that it doesn't give us anything that we can use for prediction purposes. All we can say is that once something happens, we will be able to know it. It's all intelligible. But then we sort of need to wait for it to happen, and then we can reflect on it and see which moments were expressed and all this kind of stuff. But it does mean that there is no, because of the possibility of, and the necessity, in fact, of sort of giving new accounts of the world, it means that there's no single way the world is. Some accounts will be better than others, I think, in the sense that some samples just don't function very well as samples. If I choose as a sample of a chair, a gigantic art piece or something, it's not really viable as a sample. I mean, I can't really sit on it. That seems to be important. So it's just not going to be very usable. So there are some better and worse accounts of the way things are, but they get to be redetermined over time. And so I think one thing you can take away from Hegel is that you can always suggest new samples, new concrete concepts, new accounts, and you can challenge the status quo. You can challenge what people habitually accept, and so
great ending. Thank you for sharing that. It's been a joy having you on, Dr. Raysmith.
Thank you.